program. Welcome to the MedTech Innovator Live number 8 in our series of webinars that we do as a part of the Accelerator program that runs for 4 months as an opportunity for the current cohort of 88 companies across our 3 cohorts to learn from experts across the ecosystem. For those joining us on the live stream today, welcome. MedTech Innovator is the largest accelerator of medical devices in the world, and it's a downstream accelerator. And that means that we're not necessarily looking for people with ideas, but for people with companies that are up and running, for people that have teams and prototypes and early evidence that the technology works, and then partner them with experts in the industry, strategics, and others to help them bring their product as quickly and as efficiently to the market as possible with as much value as possible. And we're opening up our webinars to the broader ecosystem beyond our cohort. So if you're on this live stream, feel free to put your questions in the chat. And for our cohort companies, you can make use of the Zoom Q&A function, and we will try and get all of your questions answered on here. And for our panelists and for our cohort, after we bid our YouTube live audience goodbye, please stay on for another half an hour of private Q&A with the cohort. And with that, welcome. I am so excited for this panel on safety and security. Super important topic in our industry. You cannot get to market without answering some pretty critical questions in that context. And we have 3 expert panelists with us today who come at these questions and this topic with very different expertise and very different background. And so I will let them introduce themselves because each of them has done a ton of different things and chances of getting it wrong are high. I would first like to welcome Kevin Fu and ask him to introduce himself. Kevin.
Hi, thank you. My name is Kevin Fu. I'm Associate Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the University of Michigan, where I direct the Archimedes Center for Healthcare and Device Security. And I've recently concluded my role in the senior leadership at the Food and Drug Administration as the nation's first acting director of medical device cybersecurity for the regulated marketplace. I'm glad to be here and I look forward to the conversation.
Excellent, thank you for that. Next, I'll ask Joe Saul to introduce himself.
Hi there, I'm Joe Saul, and I am currently serving as Privacy and Security Officer at a large political and social science data archive at the University of Michigan called ICPSR, where I am, for the most part, not working with health data, though we do have a small amount. My career up to this point, however, starting with helping to roll out HIPAA at the University of Michigan Health System, continuing there for a while, and then going on to be the chief security officer of a company that was ultimately called Truven Health Analytics, where we did healthcare data analytics and had approximately 250 million patient lives worth of data. I have continued working with HIPAA and with healthcare in a consulting role. I have a consulting practice on the side, and delighted to be here today talking about this.
And last, certainly not least, Renee Officer.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're at. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and looking forward to the conversation. My name is Renee Officer. I am fresh off of what I call a pause or a halftime. I spent the summer with my kids, and prior to that, I was the Chief Information Officer at Humana Military, which is the TRICARE East contractor administering the TRICARE contract for both the active military and then also the retirees who serve our nation, and very grateful for that opportunity. I've had a lot of experience on the payer side. I was with Humana for 18 and a half years. And prior to that, I did have a startup that was capitalized and then exited to Humana. Prior to that, consulting experience. So a lot of experience in the healthcare data side, and look forward to your questions and also learning a lot myself. So thanks for the time.
Very excited to have all three of you here. And so, especially as as this is a potentially broad topic, let's level set on the status quo. Really, the different types and sources of healthcare data, their acquisition and transmission. Kevin, I'll start with you. We've seen we've seen through your work some of the work that you pioneered quite some years ago to take a look at sensors that acquire data. What are potential sources of healthcare data you look at, or that you used to look at? And then I'll go to the other two for a little bit of a lay of the land of what are we talking about?
Sure. And so there's a bit of a yin and yang to different kinds of health data. The kinds of health data I look at is health data that's used for therapeutics and diagnostics, typically in the medical device world. And the government circles and industry has a name for this. It's called OT cybersecurity, or operational technology. It's basically everything that's not IT. So these are kinetic devices, things that make decisions based on sensor technology, things that are extremely safety critical. The complement to this in another arena would be more pure data centric things like chart data. That's not something I work with personally, but most of my concerns in my research and in my previous role in the government was looking at the safety and efficacy of medical devices, and sensors play a huge role in that.
I appreciate that. And I think you kind of almost teed it up when you talked about charting data. I would say both Joe and Reese have deep expertise in that area. I'll go to Joe next. And how do you look at the lay of the land of data?
Sure. Actually, having Kevin lead in is excellent, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from you, because in my entire HIPAA career, we've always been a little scared of medical devices, of wearable devices now, but implantable and wearable back then, because there's always been an understanding that they weren't getting the same kind of attention that the records and more traditional types of healthcare data were, and that in fact there were real tigers in that forest. There were real dangers out there. I have predominantly, in the healthcare data analytics realm, we were working with healthcare claims data and clinical data from the environment of care, as well as other large data sources. But we weren't working with medical device data at all. Maybe some health and wellness stuff where medical devices were part of the mix and collecting it. But so what we were seeing is data generated by healthcare providers, clinical records, office visit records, detailed notes, that kind of thing, and payers, the record of healthcare claims that an individual files, because we're doing data analytics for both markets and for employers who paid for healthcare. So largely we were seeing data that was generated by humans in the provider or payer environment, and often in great detail. And one of the things we were doing was de-identifying that data into large data sets so that you could do analytics on them.
Reese, that tees it up for you. I think that you've you've been on the payer side for a long time until very recently. So in many ways, generators and users of the data. What's your perspective there?
Yeah, it's actually a bit of both. I think Joe covered a lot of the stuff that we were really focused on. If you think about the claim side, coming in from providers. So we had obviously PHI. We also had just personal identifiable information, which might not contain any health information. And then, on the financial side, since we were taking payment, a lot of times we had to have concerns around financial data and PCI compliance and things like that. So more and more we are getting into, as we got into businesses like wellness, rewards, and loyalty and those kind of things, you start to think about, Fitbits or Apple, kind of of data that can be sent back, and the more IoT type data. We also got into, as we think about creating a more holistic view of a patient or a beneficiary, of a member. Started to go get third-party data and try to complement the information that we had to try to create a better picture of that individual as well. And whether that was the payer or the provider or the benefit, the beneficiary, the patient themselves, we were trying to augment it in such a way that would benefit ultimately them. The only other, I think that pretty much. Oh, I was going to add one more layer. So, when I joined the military business, the thing that got really interesting is the consideration of what they call CUI, classified, confidential, unclassified information. So, the military is pretty sensitive about who has access to their information. So you get, to start to consider other types of standards like NIST 800-171, which is what we had to be compliant with, serving, that the military client. So, so just dealing with CUI as well was just kind of that extra layer that didn't have to deal with just when I was on the Medicare side or the individual business side. Over.
And
could I add a comment that Reese's comments made me think about? Mm-hmm. We were bringing in the clinical data and the claims data, but just starting to begin to link it to other types of data sets in aggregated form. People are interested in social determinants of health, looking at health data tracked by, for example, though you can't always do it, zip code with respect to wealth and resource opportunities in those zip codes. Looking at linking it with other types of demographic information that wouldn't necessarily be reflected in the record, and certainly wouldn't be reflected in de-identified data, but can give you valuable insights about how healthcare and society interoperate. You can even look at things like do certain kinds of weather patterns lead to an increase in certain kinds of clinical issues or claims, using access to that kind of data. So they're with big aggregated data, big, not necessarily aggregated, individual level de-identified data sets, there's always an interest in sort of combining that with other environmental information to provide context for what you're seeing. It's risky. You can't always do it because it may render the data more identifiable or it may create other problems. But certainly we're starting to see more desire to combine other types of data with health data. And social determinants of health is something that we're discussing at ICPSR.
Can I perhaps just stay on the topic that you raised, that is inadvertently stepping into something, which is if you combine different sources of data, you might accidentally de-identify something. You might do something that you didn't intend to do. And those are the types of things we try to point out to our entrepreneurs to make sure in healthcare IT that's a real challenge. Sure. In devices it can be different. What are some of those real life stories of risks where you might get it wrong?
I'm gonna have to keep it broad, obviously, rather than giving specific examples. But essentially, there are two ways to de-identify health data under HIPAA. First, if you don't rigidly follow one of them, the data is not de-identified, right? So lists of just personally identifiable information, demographic information, addresses and stuff, if they came in as part of a health data set as PHI, you can't just pull those out and say this is de-identified because there's no health data in it. I have a feeling Reese is very familiar with this set of issues from his role. But once you have de-identified a data set under HIPAA, you've either done it using the safe harbor method, where you remove certain identifiers, you reduce the granularity on a couple of the other identifiers, and you're legally good to go. You've got a data set that you can use. It's not PHI anymore. But it is significantly inadequate for the purposes of a lot of research and analytics, because the only element of date you're allowed to keep is year. So not only do you not know how much time passed between two events, if they happen in the same year, you can't even be fully confident what order they happened in, unless it's something like an appendectomy and appendicitis. But even there can be some questions. So the other way, and the way that we use to generate the big de-identified data sets that we provided access to, and the way we're likely to do it on some research projects that I have knowledge of now, is called the statistical method, or the expert method of de-identification. And with that, you get somebody who has the statistical expertise. They don't really define what represents that expertise, but who has the expertise to look at a health data set, say, you need to remove these elements, or, okay, you can have some geocoding, you can have some dates, but you can't have both at that level of granularity because that makes it too identifiable. Brief comment on that. The number of US nationals who can be uniquely identified by sex, birth date, and zip code is startlingly high. It's a higher percentage of population uniques than you would expect. So that kind of thing comes into play. So you're ordinarily working with a data set where you've had an expert roll in and say, okay, this data set as we've prepared it is safe. It meets the HIPAA statistical de-identification standard. And then you get someone who comes along and says, that's great, but I need to add some kind of demographic information to it, right? Like standard geographical areas and their economic characteristics. I need to add that into this so that we have this individual, and we also know what kind of an area that individual lives in, right? And when you look at that, you will ordinarily find, when you license a data set like that from somebody who's knowledgeable, that there will be limitations on, you won't be allowed to link that data set to any other data set straight out of the box. And that's because if you find a way to link it, that combined data set, it no longer fits under the determination of it being de-identified data, and may in fact pose additional risk. You might be wondering, how would you be able to link it? The answer is you might be able to do it probabilistically. You might be given a data set that gives you a bit too much information from that perspective, or you might be asking the people who have the fully identifiable or partially identifiable data set to create a linked data set for you, but that would go over the line in terms of identifiability. So the problem, this is really a problem on the supply end. You might want to provide a rich data set that also has social determination of health type data in it, but to do that, it would be too identifiable, if that makes sense. But a researcher or a company that has access to all of this data may or may not be aware that what they're creating is in fact more identifiable than it should be, based on adding geographical breakdowns that are outside the county state, but focus on income and demographics. That makes sense?
It does. Reese, do you want to respond to that before I go to Kevin and go more devices? That looked like a no.
No, that was good.
All right.
He knows his stuff.
Hope it was coherent. That's
Extremely.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, we talked about this a little bit. Devices generating data, but also so staying on this topic of things that can potentially go wrong inadvertently, leaving something open to mistakes or sometimes malicious activity. I'd love to hear your perspective on physical, I'm going to call it messing with devices, as well as digital messing with devices. What are some things that can go wrong? And what should fledgling companies do to not let that happen to them?
Okay, good questions. A lot of different tangents we could go on, but maybe I'll just begin with some level setting of what does it even mean to say security or privacy or cybersecurity, which tends to be the more government industry term. I find when people use the word security, they don't really mean the word security. They mean something else. They've just given you a hint on what they're trying to preserve about some kind of property, but they haven't really told you. And so I would first drill down into, there are three sort of classic interpretations of the word, the phrase security and privacy. One would be confidentiality, one would be integrity, and another would be availability. There are other properties, but these are the three sort of big ones that are most common. So for things involving privacy, you're almost inevitably going to be talking about keeping things confidential. For things in the medical device world, or for things where sensors are driving some kind of physical mechanism, we tend to focus on the other two properties, that is integrity and availability. The number one property today for medical devices, whether it's safety or security, would be availability, because a medical device unavailable to deliver care is not a safe and effective medical device. So if you have a healthcare system that gets knocked offline by ransomware and their patient monitors or their infusion pumps aren't able to do the work, those are not available. They're not safe nor effective. Now, if you start to talk about the world of physical access and such, there's research and then there's problems of today. And so depending where you are in this time horizon, I would say you'll have a different lens. And so with my researcher hat, we tend to focus on problems 5 to 10, sometimes 20 years out, trying to be creative enough to predict what kind of problems we'll be having to cope with, because a lot of the medical devices we have today might last 20 or 30 years. There's some radiation therapy devices, capital equipment, the magnet in an MRI. These things have to last for decades. And so in my research is inspired by this long-term vision. We look at how to protect sensors from an adversary who can actually exploit the physics of circuits and systems in order to control computers and get them to do things that the designer didn't intend. So one example would be my students were looking at how to use lasers to take control of voice control assistants by shining a laser at the microphone port on top of things like a Google Home or an Apple iPhone microphone. It turns out if you shine a laser, even through a plate glass window, you can actually trick the microphones into hearing false, non-existent, coherent conversations like, open the garage door. And this bypasses the security controls of typical voice assistants because it just assumes, well, the sensor told me something, so it must be trustworthy, but that's actually not true. And so at the research world, we look at how to exploit optics, lasers, radio communication, RF, injection attacks, even sound waves. You can use sound waves just like the opera singer who hits the resonant frequency of a wine glass and can cause that wine glass to shatter. You can also hit the resonant frequency of the silicon inside a semiconductor of a sensor to actually change the behavior of that sensor and then control its output. So you can essentially sing a computer virus to some degree to some sensors. Now, this is all pretty advanced, big R, little d research and development. Again, these are problems that are 5 to 10 years out, but when you've got a product line that has a 10-year horizon, you need to be creative enough and agile enough such that 10 years from now, you can protect against that. So getting to your final question in there, well, you know, if you're a small company or even a big company, what should you be doing now if you're new to preserving availability and integrity of some kind of device in the midst of an adversary? Well, step one for me, or step zero, would be threat modeling. Whether you're in the regulated space of medical devices, which is globally regulated by most countries across the globe, you will want to do threat modeling. Threat modeling is the security equivalent to what's known as hazard analysis. So in the safety world, you would do hazard analysis, you would identify risks built inherent to your system, and you would decide which risks are acceptable, conditionally acceptable, or unacceptable at a very high level. And then you design your system around this honest admission of, look, there's risk all around us. We can't make it go to zero, but we can decide which risks that we take, and we can reduce the risks and control the risks. And so threat modeling is all about characterizing the adversary in a generic enough way that you can be nimble and agile, such that if a new vulnerability comes out a week from now, you don't have to pull your hair out saying, oh, well, I guess we shipped that, nothing we can do. No, you need to have a plan in place of how to address these unknown unknowns. I'll just give you an example of that. In the medical device world, the FDA routinely receives essentially design documents that contain the security engineering component of the medical device. And the FDA looks for things like threat models. And there's plenty of bad threat models out there. There's some threat models where I would say some of the $10 billion companies probably would get a failing grade in my class had they submitted it as a term project, let alone a medical device 510K or pre-market PMA. But there's also some great security engineering work being done out there. The threat model would be, for instance, stating your assumptions. So one thing I like to see in the medical device world is when a manufacturer starts off with, well, we're going to assume that an adversary controls the network entirely. They have the ability to alter, drop, and replay packets. And we're going to show you now how our product remains having high integrity and high availability, even though an adversary has that advanced capability. Now, notice when you define a threat model in this way, you're not talking about products. I don't talk about whether you've deployed a firewall. I don't talk about whether you've installed a Microsoft product or an Apple product. It doesn't matter. These are properties, and it has to be nimble enough that you don't have to get into mechanisms. The mechanisms come later, but it's all about admitting what the adversary can do and defining and talking about the assets you're trying to protect. You can't protect everything. And so it's really important to figure out what is inside your trusted computing base, that what you innately trust, what you continuously verify, and so on and so forth. Now, to the small companies, this can be pretty daunting. But that doesn't mean there's sort of a get out of jail free card. You still need to do appropriate security engineering. The small companies will have different strategies from the larger ones. The larger ones might have an in-house security engineering team. Strongly advised to keep that testing team separate from the design team so that you don't follow your own assumptions. But a small company, sometimes they will have their own security engineers. Sometimes they'll work with third parties. But there are ways to do this. And the good news is, if you get the threat modeling right in the beginning, the implementation and a lot of the construction of security elements is much easier and much lower cost in the long run if you get the threat modeling right. So step one, always get the threat model done. Otherwise, you're likely to be throwing a lot of money out the window at sort of half-baked ideas that don't do what you thought.
If we were in a big room right now, instead of on Zoom, I would look into the audience and say, okay, of all of you, how many have done threat modeling, to see raised hands? But we're not. And so we just assume people in front of their, and I'm not surprised Joe has, but we're not. And so it's for once, we will not have a direct answer of that one. We might follow up with the cohort and ask them direct questions. But let me shift gears a little bit. I think Kevin, you've teed up for us just how scary things can be, which is important. I think you need to know all the things that can potentially go wrong. Before we go deep into doom and gloom, I'd love to actually go about benefits of connected data. And I know in my prep call with Reese, we had a conversation around really benefits of being able to connect data platforms. So in this particular case, we're going back away from devices, back straight into data. Reese, tell us about the benefits. Tell us about what kind of world look like in which we have mitigated the risks and connected lots of data sources for faster, better patient outcomes.
Sure. And in the example we talked about, we actually started with a pretty substantial consumer friction, which is in the form of utilization management. So if any of you have ever received care in a provider that's required your healthcare insurer to authorize that care, that can be pretty friction-full. And, in the event that you need, let's say, an orthopedic procedure like a hip replacement or knee replacement or something like that, that could, that could create a lot of admin burden on the provider side. It could delay care on the patient side. There's a lot of back and forth that could happen just to get the care you need kind of through the system and approved by the payer. And so what we were able to do, and it was the idea of team members at Humana, Ross Lager, name them, Brian Loy, Jimmy Long, Ross Lagerblade. They had an idea, and they felt like, if we could align on what good care looks like, wouldn't it be a lot easier just to get agreement up front? There's evidence-based medical best practices, that's out there. Those knowledge of those care pathways exist. Why don't we just align, with, as a payer and a provider, that this is what good care looks like, and if we agree to, to operate within the guardrails of that good care, then we'll just approve essentially the whole called the care pathway. And so, when I think about that, and actually, from a data perspective, if you think about a pathway and a series of activities that need to happen in order, what we coined as from diagnosis to dog walking, in the event of a hip replacement or knee replacement, there's a lot of different activities that need to happen, and so we would essentially create a pathway that was just data, that would have a series of activities. It might be prehab, it might be in an office visit, MRI or X-ray or something like that. If it required a surgical procedure, it may actually be the medical device. It may be the facility that's going to be in play, and for aftercare, in the event that you had a 2-story home, it may be some type of DMI, a bed, let's say, that needs to be delivered to your home. All of those things came into what we call the pathway. So when we called it the Care Pathway Collaborative, and it was incubated inside of Humana. Ultimately, it was exited when we actually hit product market fit. But as I think about that, by the ones, if I have one provider who is following a care pathway, for a handful of patients, and creating better outcomes and reducing admin burden, that's a success, right? When I think about it at scale, it's a disruptor. And what happens is, now think about it, when you're not treating, a handful of patients in one particular geography, but you're treating hundreds of thousands of patients, across the country or across the globe, and you have access to not only those pathways that were leveraged, but also within each of the pathways at the more granular level. It could be the provider, it could be the medical device, it could be all of those things. And then you bring in patient data. Joel was talking about it earlier in terms of the granularity of the patient data that you have access to, some of the determinants, that could be, part of that patient data. And then you incorporate the outcomes. You've essentially created a platform that could disintermediate the payer entirely, or become a value-based platform in itself. So, and it also, when you think about trials, clinical trials and things like that, say you're an academic institution who happens to be in network, you could derivate from an actual care pathway that's evidence-based best practice, and you could start to introduce some things into that. You might have a little bit more friction in terms of authorizations, but at least you're creating an opportunity to evaluate, uses of different devices or different practices within that pathway. And that becomes a test essentially that then goes, against the broader data set. And for me, that was really powerful in thinking about how, we could take this, this pathway concept and really, open it up and become a testing ground for future care. And also for these, I think it just creates a tremendous opportunity on the clinical trials too, and testing these devices more at scale, and having access to a really rich data set, to improve the care, improve the health outcomes, and obviously, lower the cost for the country and on the healthcare side. So that's when hopefully that answers your question in terms of, the potential of this. I think as we see things go into more value-based care, that really, sets the table, for digital platforms to become part of that equation, beyond just health systems. And then also, flash forward, I really think medical device companies have a tremendous opportunity in that space as well.
So we have a picture of a bright future on the one hand, where good data integration leads to better value-based care. We also have potential huge risks on the physical side as well on the data side. I want to give both Joe and Kevin an opportunity to weigh in or to respond to that before going towards more what is the bigger picture on regulation. What does the present and what does the future of that look like? And you get to say, no, let's talk about regulation.
Kevin, do you want to take this?
Sure. Let's talk about regulation.
And then I'll come around.
So
that is, go for it.
Okay. So there are many different regulatory pathways depending upon the situation. And for privacy elements, I'm going to defer to my other fellow speakers on things like OCR, Office of Civil Rights. But I usually scope OCR as what I would call a post-market activity, which would be a euphemism for fines and such. The medical device front works very differently. There is a post-market element, but there's also a pre-market. So in the medical device world, it is highly regulated for a good reason. And in most cases, a manufacturer needs to seek to have clearance or approval from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration before they can legally market and sell a medical device in the United States. And so if this is a device that's therapeutic or diagnostic, it generally requires one of these regulatory pathways. And so I find that very interesting because that means you can look at design documents as a government regulator. Whereas for privacy, as far as I know, you don't, the regulators don't get to see design documents before you implement something. So it's more along the lines of, oops, something went wrong, now you get a fine. Whereas in the medical device space, before there's an opportunity for harm, the FDA is there to review the design documents from the manufacturer to either give clearance or approval that the risks are appropriately managed to keep these devices safe and effective. So those are two very different regulatory pathways.
So I'm going to be the guy who comes in here and says something maybe a little questionable. It's not, but it's not something you're necessarily going to hear a lot. And it's this. Healthcare is an area where the privacy and security of data are highly regulated by US standards. The safety of the devices is even more highly regulated, but I'm not going to talk about that. That's more a Kevin topic. But healthcare is also an area where there is a value that's more important than privacy, and that value is patient safety. So you'll find in a lot of organizations, and I won't give names, but you'll find in a health system, for example, that and it might surprise outsiders to hear this, access to a patient's medical record is not technically restricted only to people known to be working with the patient. Broadly, anybody in the workforce could access that patient's data because you don't know where they're going to end up. They could be in the orthopedic clinic and have to get transferred to the emergency department after an accident. Somebody could present at a branch health clinic that they hadn't seen there before, and they need access to the records. And there is tremendous safety benefit to having broad access to healthcare records. And you mitigate that from a privacy perspective by having really good audit trails and looking at them to see if inappropriate accesses pop up, but not by locking the data out. And I want to be especially careful when I talk about this topic around startups, because kind of the startup ethos is move fast, break things, fix it later. And that's not really a mindset I want to encourage in healthcare. But I do want to say that the benefits that you get from, for example, interoperability, which are immense, are to a certain extent countervailed by the risks you get from a security perspective, more attack surfaces, more ways in, and from a privacy perspective. While we're moving all this data around, are we being as careful about consents as we need to be? When you have a hospital join an HIE and that hospital has patients who have specifically said, I don't want Dr. So-and-so to see my records because maybe Dr. So-and-so is their ex-husband or something like that. Often a family connection is where the really bad stories come from. That gets broken once the data is loaded into an HIE potentially, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have HIEs. We should have HIEs because the patient safety benefits, in addition to the benefits that Reese was talking about improving care, which I wholeheartedly agree with everything you said, Reese, but the safety benefits alone would be enough to say this is something we must do. At the same time, it is going to increase risk around both security and privacy. And when you get more IoT devices into the mix, that increases attack surfaces, which is sort of the security insider way of saying things people could try to hack to get at the data. But again, probably worth it for the ultimate benefits you get. So I don't want to say, hey, go ahead, move fast, break things. But I do want to say that when we look at risk, we look at mitigating it. You can never completely eliminate it. Everybody on this call knows that. And you do potentially accept some additional risk as you make the environment of care more complex, as you share data more broadly. And that's maybe okay. It's still your responsibility to minimize how much additional risk you add. It's still your responsibility to stay on the right side of the law. But understand there's always a balancing act in this kind of situation. And I'll pause for rebuttals or comments.
I'm pausing for rebuttals and comments as well. I don't know if either of you wants to jump in on that one. But otherwise, I'd like to kind of just look at what have the last 2-3 years really changed in our respective worlds. The two things that for me immediately come to mind, but there's probably more things that come to your minds. The two things that come to my mind is a bit over a year ago, the Biden administration issued a presidential order on cybersecurity labeling. And then, of course, with the pandemic, we've gone to way more telemedicine than we ever have. Those two things don't play in a vacuum. And I would love for all three of you actually to weigh in on this. I'm happy to have either of you jump in first. Otherwise, I will nominate Kevin. Just that the Cybersecurity Act, how has that impacted your world?
Well, there have been multiple cybersecurity executive orders.
Dang.
I would say the one that has affected the medical device world the most would be the May 2021 executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity of infrastructure. It was a hugely technical document. I don't recall seeing a document so technical ever in an executive order. So there clearly was a very educated staff person. It talked about requirements of threat modeling. It talked about requirements of software bill of materials in order for a company to sell anything to the US government. And it was quite clear that this executive order is about the power of the purse to influence the greater market, since the government is such a large purchaser. So let's say you want to sell something to the VA. Well, you're going to have to provide a software bill of materials. What is a software bill of materials? It's an ingredient list of all the third-party software on the inside of your product. And just like if you go off and buy a candy bar or go to the grocery store, you get to see what's on the inside. It's now time that we have that for complicated integrated products that contain software. Now, there are different degrees of detail for an SBOM. In the medical device space, FDA has actually proposed what it wants to see in the ingredient list, and that includes the name of each software package, the date at which that particular sub-manufacturer is no longer going to support it with updates and patches. Are there any known vulnerabilities in that third-party software that have not yet been mitigated? How is the manufacturer mitigating those risks if they have something that's got a known vulnerability? So the idea of a software bill of materials and threat modeling is now inside an executive order. You'll get into topics like zero trust, which is a bit of a buzzword, but has some real meat behind it in the sense of moving away from the executive order really helped push a movement away from perimeter-based thinking. You've all probably heard about firewalls. That's not only as important for pure data, but it's also relevant for protecting medical devices. However, it is not a panacea. If you assume that some perimeter-based thinking is going to be your primary way of protecting any kind of security property, you're going to be quite dissatisfied, and so will the regulators. And so instead, it talks about how do we build a system where we don't have to trust the individual components, but we can build a trustworthy system out of effectively insecure components. It's a somewhat non-intuitive engineering practice, but it leads to more resilient systems. You want to be able to have your system continue to succeed even if small components fail, is sort of the philosophy here. And so that executive order is driving things of that nature. A final point I want to mention from the executive order, and there are many things inside of it, but one that to highlight is the Cybersecurity Safety Review Board. So Biden had proposed and has now impaneled this group of cybersecurity experts who are the equivalent to the NTSB. So, you know, in the NTSB world, an accident happens, there's a plane crash, investigators go in and try to figure out what went wrong, what lessons can be learned. The Cybersecurity Safety Review Board has a similar role. So in major incidents, they will go in and look at what lessons can be learned so we don't repeat this. And so I believe there was a recent report on what's called Log4j, which was a logging tool that's common in all sorts of software on the back end, cloud services and such. And it was so trivial to compromise. Even my son had his Minecraft server compromised from this Log4j vulnerability. And so he was really curious about what I was doing that week. So the Cybersecurity Safety Review Board plays a really important role in making sure we don't repeat mistakes. So that's my perspective on that particular executive orders. And as you point out, there are many others, but the May 2021, I would say, is the one that affects medical devices the most.
And I appreciate that. That is indeed the only one that I actually looked at, but that is why I really appreciate that piece of the education. I'm happy to have either Joe or Reese or both jump in on that one. I'm also happy to kind of like move more into the telemedicine world and what that means for your work. Either's fine.
I was gonna pick up on the telemedicine. I think just if you think about me as a patient and my my prior affinity probably to be in person, and the feeling like I was only getting good care if I was in a facility, talking face to face with a physician or clinician, and how that entirely flipped with the pandemic. And it happened for the majority of the nation, as we went from probably 30% or less telemedicine visits, to 70+% telemedicine visits in a very, very short order. So I think just the comfort of getting care digitally or virtually, and kind of the mindset shift, it just accelerated tremendously over the last 2 years. The other thing I think is important and also impactful, on the cybersecurity, data security side, is just the distribution of work, where historically we were all in office side by side. You could control those settings a lot better than when all of a sudden your teams are distributed, not only across the country, which is kind of the parameters or the boundaries that military defense puts on us, and Humana specifically would put on us, but you start to scale globally, and you have nomadic workers and just considerations you didn't have to have before, on data and where it's located, and considerations you have to have, based on location. So I would say those two things for me are things that are really top of mind when you ask that question.
I'd like to touch on that one too. And Reese raises the point not only about telemedicine, but about remote work in fields that touch healthcare data generally. Prior to the pandemic, that isn't something that most of us were very comfortable with. In my role as CSO at my previous employer, I wouldn't have been authorizing people to work from home on protected health information without very good, very narrow reasons. And then you got to have a conversation about the work environment, right? I mean, in our facility, as in Humana, I'm confident, and any other facility that deals with a significant amount of health data, you have to card in, you likely have to have a visible badge around your neck even to be on the premises. You're careful about the orientation of screens and windows. I've actually caught that, by the way. I reviewed a new office we were using back in the day. No one was there yet. I walked up to the building, peered through the windows. Like, I don't want to get arrested as an office peeper, but I needed to know, right? And I could actually see some of the monitor screens and read text on them. So when I went in, I'm like, you need privacy screens. And all of that control that you have over the physical environment where the work is being done, you lose all of that when they go home. You can give them lists of things they need to do, like, look, if you have don't let your kid play Minecraft on your work computer, for a whole lot of reasons. I mean, I could spend 10 minutes on why that's bad. So there's a lot of control you give up. And similarly, shifting from office visits to telemedicine, there's a fair amount of control you give up. One of them is that these very sensitive conversations are being transacted across a usually third-party conferencing service. So they then become part of your circle of trust, right? They potentially are retaining highly sensitive data. They potentially become an attack surface, and the whole litany of problems. You've just expanded your perimeter massively. And on the other side of that, there are people who wouldn't have gotten care if they'd had to go into an office. There are overworked clinical staffs that wouldn't have been able to provide care to as many patients. I mean, I would be more likely to take a telehealth appointment even now than go into the office, because I don't have to drive 20 minutes each way and sit in a waiting room for an hour. I mean, I can work around it. So it's another one of these situations where the benefits are huge. And yeah, it also raises risks, both around security and privacy, as we've talked about them. But you balance it out and you try to mitigate the risks as much as you can. I mean, there are physicians who prior to this wouldn't move patient information in email. And the policy at many institutions was you don't do it without direct permission from the patient, because you don't know who else is reading their email, for example. We've now hung all of that out there. but we've done it in the name of better availability of care. Is it a good trend? Probably. Does it make the lives of people who have to protect the privacy and security of data and patient safety in this environment harder? Probably. But again, it's got patient safety benefits and benefits for quality of care. It's also got disadvantages. There are things you don't see on a call like that. One unusual risk, and I won't go into it deeply, you can think out what the details might be, is people in a face-to-face visit may show sensitive parts of their bodies or their children's bodies to the clinician as part of the exam process. I read an article about a guy who had to send a photo of a part of his child's anatomy to a doctor and mailed it through Gmail. Gmail's automated services, there was an injury, right? I mean, it was completely legit. Gmail's services flagged it as child pornography. And to this day, he has no access to Google services, apparently, because even though they got an email from the physician saying, no, this is clinical, I told him, it's been flagged up. So you do run a risk conducting business that's normally done in private over the internet. And some of the risks are not what you might anticipate, but it balances, maybe.
Time has flown, as it does when we're having interesting conversations. And I want to give each of you an opportunity before we bid our YouTube audience goodbye to point something out that you found interesting, or to leave our audience with a final piece of advice. And of course, we will, as after bidding our YouTube audience goodbye, stay on for a private Q&A with the cohort. But just want to give you that opportunity. The reason we invited all three of you is because you bring such different pieces of the puzzle to the table. And I think the discussion has shown that. Any final words of advice or things that you'd like to point out? And no is a fine answer as well. Oh, that sounds like a no. Oh, Kevin.
Just my final advice would be make sure you do your threat modeling, whether it's for confidentiality of data, or in my case, integrity and availability of therapeutics and diagnostics. You got to do your threat modeling first. If you don't do your pre-lab, you can't do your lab. You got to do step one before you can do step two.
And I'd like to say, even in Kevin's world, don't forget about the confidentiality part. It's still the law, even though obviously integrity and availability or safety, they're more important. But you are unlikely to be an expert on this, and you may in fact have to borrow expertise for the threat modeling portion, whether that's reading up, whether that's talking to peers about what they do, whether that's bringing in a consultant who does it. That's not me, by the way, so I'm not marketing. Get the help you need to review it, because it's the stuff you don't think about that'll get you.
And finally, Reese.
Wow, that's interesting, because I was actually going to say the same thing. As I'm sitting here listening to Kevin and Joe talk, I'm just like, wow, I'm way out of my league, and I would love to tap into Kevin's, classes and have him be a consultant, and Joe just the expertise that he brings. So I would like to echo what Joe said. I think it's really important. You don't have to be experts at this team, the cohort that you have, you're experts at a lot of other things, and you're delivering really powerful solutions. It has to be considerate of, the data, compliance needs that comes along with being in this space, in the healthcare space, but you do not have to be the expert at it. You can always leverage in and lean into somebody else. And you got two incredible candidates sitting right at this table, to do that. So I'm grateful for the time, grateful for the conversation. I've learned a lot, and look forward to watching the innovation that's happening through MedTech Innovators and beyond. Over.
I am so delighted at this, and I would like our audience to know that I didn't set our panelists up to say these exact words, but what I will add is that we have phenomenal partners And so that is what you don't see in this conversation is many of the conversations we are having with our partner organizations that encompass great consultants in a lot of these areas. And so more conversations will be had around that. But with that, we will thank our panelists. Thank you very much for being here, and we'll bid our YouTube live